You guys don't have to follow along on this one because this isn't a feature we're going to be implementing in our user interface, but I want to talk about blend modes real quick because blend modes are a powerful tool. They're not always going to come into play. In fact, usually they will not come into play for user interface design because when it's time to hand your assets over to the developers to build the application, they can be a serious problem. They can actually completely mess up the visual nature of your user interface because the blend modes don't export. Your objects can't preserve the blend modes because what blend modes do is they determine how one object interacts with another object that it's overlapping with, and not in the same way as Boolean operations do. This isn't about shape, this is about blending, hence the name blend modes. So I'm going to move this box that I created on top of my picture here, and I'm going to change the blending from normal to multiply. That's one example there. What multiply does is it takes the color value or the luminance value of the shape above and it darkens into the shape below, essentially making white transparent and black opaque, and everything in between gets burned in appropriately. We've got another one here called screen that does just the opposite. White becomes opaque and black becomes transparent, and everything in between gets blended appropriately. Then we have overlay, and overlay is sort of halfway between the two. Both the light and dark pixels get multiplied together, and typically you end up with a result that's brighter and more colorful than before. But that has to do with how bright the values are in the first place. Dark values get darker, bright values get brighter, and it therefore increases the contrast of the two overlapping objects. So there are a bunch of blend modes here. There are too many for us to talk about, and they're all different. And they each perform a different mathematical function. But just know that you can explore these, you can do whatever you want with them, and you may have a problem when it's time to export. Because again, Sketch is doing this mathematical formula for us that shows us the result of this blending, but when it's time to export and go out of Sketch and have the application built, that's not going to happen anymore unless the app developers develop the objects to interact that way, so that can be a problem. Another thing I want to point out is that there is blending up here, and that blending is affecting the entire object, the fill, the border, shadows, anything else that we have on it. But also we have an individual blending mode for the fill, which does not affect the border. If I go and I change that to multiply, the border gets left alone, and then the brightness, or in this case the darkness of the color fill, is being multiplied into the background, but the border is being left alone. The border looks exactly the way it did before I switched the blending mode there. The next thing is opacity, and opacity is very simple, and opacity is more than friendly with creating assets for developers. Opacity is just a simple 0 to 100% scale, determining whether or not a shape is transparent or translucent or opaque. So we will be implementing that at one point or another because opacity is totally developer friendly. And again, we've got opacity for our fills, and we can turn down the opacity of the fill without affecting the border. And it may not look like we have opacity for the border, but if you click on the color fill, there's a slider underneath our hue spectrum, and that slider is the alpha or transparency or opacity of that fill. And that's just the fill of the border itself. It's not the actual shape fill. So just about everything has an inherent opacity, and most things start at 100%, but you can reduce that opacity to get things to blend together.